when we look at our housing crisis that's impacting on now the traveller accommodation crisis, the starting point, I think, has to be a right to housing. And when we look at that, the United Nations defines a right to housing that is adequate housing. It must be habitable in terms of providing the inhabitants with adequate space and protecting them from cold, damp, heat, rain, wind, or other threats to health. And importantly, it should be culturally adequate, which means it should enable the expression of cultural identity and diversity of housing. That's really important because the Irish state has signed up to implementing and fulfilling this right to adequate housing under the International Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights. The issue is that while the Irish government has signed up to this, there is no real legal pressure points by which the state can be held accountable. And the report makes this point, which is the need to put the right to housing and the right to adequate housing in our constitution, which the report states, and I completely agree with that. And I think it's fundamental because until we take an approach to housing, to traveller accommodation that comes from the perspective of this obligation on the state to deliver habitable and culturally adequate housing, I really don't feel that our system and our state is going to tackle this crisis adequately. So I do feel that that recommendation of putting the right to the housing in our constitution is fundamental. The role of the state itself in creating homelessness. And I was really struck by that because that is something that I think needs to get a lot more focus and highlighting, because we have all this at a national level in the media. We have a lot of focus on homelessness, you know, the concern with it, politicians expressing, government, the state saying, you know, we're all signed up to ending homelessness. Yet here we have our state creating homelessness, and the examples are detailed in the report in terms of the continued criminalization of travellers and also the issues of evicting travellers in terms of overcrowding and halting sites. And I think that's something that really needs to be focused on, because the state itself cannot be evicting people in this country into homelessness. The other issue is what you've talked about, and it's something that my own research has focused on before, which is the issue of the private rental sector creating homelessness and the change in our social housing policy to become completely reliant on the private rental sector to deliver social housing. And this has had a compounding impact on the discrimination experienced by travellers. And this report finds this again. And if we think about it, what has happened is that if you are in need of social housing, if you're entitled to social housing, the main way you get social housing now is through the housing assistance payment in the private rental sector. But as you've pointed out, and as the report points out, there's a fundamental problem with this, because for travellers who experience this overwhelming discrimination in the private rental sector, they literally cannot access social housing under the current social housing policy because they are excluded from the private rental sector. Our national social housing policy that is overwhelmingly dependent on the housing assistance payment in the private rental sector to deliver social housing is overly discriminates against travellers because of the discrimination they experience in the private rental sector. So our social housing policy is compounding the accommodation crisis of travellers. And I think this in part explains why travellers are spending longer in emergency accommodation and why over time they make up a higher proportion of homeless families, is because there is literally no exit possibility for travellers from homeless accommodation because of the over-reliance on the housing assistance payment. And in this way, we see policy has compounded the traveller accommodation crisis. There is an issue as well, which is the overcrowding in halting sites, which brings back again the whole issue and reminded me, and I was conscious of it, and of course the group was set up in the context of the Carrick Mines tragedy. And the report that went to the Department of Housing just before December, which highlighted the serious risk of life in the halting site in Cork. And while I know Cork City Council is responding to that now, I think that there's a real question of, has the state, and I don't think it has, adequately responded to avoid another Carrick Mines tragedy. And I think that again needs to be continuously named, that the state has not done enough in response to Carrick Mines to avoid another one. This crisis is not one of the making of travellers. This crisis is the one that is the making of a combination of historical, systemic, endemic discrimination towards travellers and the failures of housing policy currently. And therefore, I think the state has an additional and a particular responsibility to undo the crisis and ameliorate and end the crisis faced by the accommodation crisis faced by travellers, because it created it historically and it continues to create it today. And therefore, that's the obligation that I feel is on the state.